Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today with the Nova Scotia Grief Alliance. My name is Melissa MacDonald, and I am one of the Community Grief Facilitators with the Nova Scotia Hospice Palliative Care Association. Go ahead.
My name's Rune Black, and we are going to be taking a look at the Grief Alliance land acknowledgement now for you.
So before we begin, I'd like to start by saying we are meeting today on the unceded and traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq people who have lived in this region for thousands of years. The Mi'kmaq have a deep and enduring relationship with this land, rooted in culture, spirituality, and history. We honor and respect the knowledge, resilience, and ongoing contributions of the Mi'kmaq, as well as all Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis people. We also recognize the lasting impacts of colonization and the vital connection between land and healing. As we gather to reflect on grief, healing, and emotional wellness, we acknowledge the importance of cultural understanding, community support in nurturing spiritual, emotional, mental, and physical well-being. You'll notice the image of a drum on our slides today. This is a piece from the Mi'kmaq artist Alan Syliboy. In Mi'kmaq culture, the whale is known to help people in need. Whether we are helpless or wounded, the whale symbolizes kindness, intelligence, and compassion. And I hope that we can all take these attributes into consideration as we listen and learn about grief today. So before we get started, just a few quick housekeeping pieces. This session will be recorded and posted on our Grief Alliance website. We do encourage a safe, supportive space for sharing and ask that all discussions remain respectful. We ask that you keep your microphones muted during the presentation just to minimize background noise. Questions are welcome at any time in the chat. Rune and I will do our best to respond as we go along. And if there's any time that you want to come off mic, just raise your hand. That'd be great. And if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, you can message Beth Lynch, Rune, or myself. And then I don't want to take up all your time with what the Grief Alliance is, but if this is your first time here, I wanted to let you know that all of our events are open to anyone who is working, volunteering, or interested in being within the grief spaces. Upcoming, we have a webinar in March that will talk about grief in relation to veterinary medicine. Our speaker will also discuss how to support clients, friends, and family who may be working with those who have experienced the loss of a pet, either by death or being hospitalized, and registration for that is now open. There will also be a community-facing webinar in April from Kathleen, who is our presenter, that can be found on our Nova Scotia Hospice Palliative Care Association website. With the Grief Alliance, we also have roundtables, which will be held in regions across Nova Scotia. We are doing our first virtual roundtable. So this is to provide a space for networking amongst peers, highlight local grief initiatives, and gather insight on grief needs and opportunities within local communities. Our virtual roundtable will be in April, and it'll be focused on creating spaces for suicide loss and grief. We are hoping to connect providers in these spaces across the province and bring forth a rich discussion while exploring and understanding grief related to suicide loss and how to carry and provide a braver space for those who are grieving these types of losses. As we look forward, we're always adapting and growing based on the feedback of our community and those who work and step into the grief spaces to provide support. You are always helping us to better understand and address the evolving needs. If there's any more information you would like, you can visit the Grief Alliance website at nsgriefalliance.ca or email us at griefalliance@nshpca.ca. So as Rune and I said, it is our pleasure to introduce ourselves. Rune is a queer former youth in care, a death doula, and a registered social worker that holds her master's in social work. She has dedicated the last 7 years on the front line on the downtown east side of Vancouver. During this time, Rune specialized in harm reduction, trauma and crisis, outreach, perinatal substance use, 2S LGBTQIA+, grief care, as well as group and individual counseling, mental health, activism, and internal medicine. I am a registered nurse and business owner with over a decade of experience in pediatric, palliative, and community-based care. My background is in grief and bereavement support, program development, and culturally responsive service delivery. I hold certificates in children's and youth grief, bereavement, and palliative care, as well as being Canadian certified in perinatal mental health. I also have experience in implementing mutual support and debriefing within my previous roles. So, today we will be talking to you about the basics of grief and how to navigate the grief of those we support. Our plan for today is to talk about what is grief, the different types of grievers we may encounter in our roles, understanding grief, loss, and mourning and the differences between them, the good 5 stages of grief, and how that can challenge our work, changing our outlook on grief, changing or challenging the grief story that shows up for people, and then some great resources for everyone. We would like to offer you all an invitation to care for yourself today. This is a heavy subject and may bring up your own emotions and experiences. We understand that grief can show up at any time, and this is a topic that can activate your own feelings. We ask that you show up today with your own self-care and awareness. Trust in yourself and the ways that you have supported those who are grieving. We are all here today to gain knowledge, to better ourselves and the spaces that we fill. Active listening, as well as allowing those who step into our care to choose how they need to be supported, are two very important ways in which we create braver spaces. And finally, our expectations. We must be aware of our own thoughts and beliefs about grief before we can support others in their grief journey.
So right now we're going to kind of take a look here and see how you guys are feeling. We're going to do a little poll. Beth is going to pop up a little poll for you guys. There's going to be a little box that comes up on your screen, and we would just like to see and check in with you all. How would you rate your understanding of grief at this time, the beginning of this webinar? So we're just asking, like, 1, I know nothing about it and I don't really want to talk about it, but I'm here. 5 would be fairly confident, and 10, it's like, I'm super confident with this topic. I work in this space. I live and breathe grief. So we have some experts always in the room because we know, as per Marilyn MacDonald, the expert is the griever. And I'm sure you all have some personal experience, but also are providing some safer spaces for grief support. It looks like we're at about a 7 on average here. So we got a little bit of people feeling pretty confident overall, and that's great. Awesome to know. Thank you so much. We'll do another check-in soon. So first of all, we want to just take a look here at the definitions of grief. I always like to take a look at what good old Google is saying these days. And the Merriam-Webster definition, as well as just the Google definition, comes up as the following: deep, poignant distress caused by or as if by bereavement, a cause of suffering, trouble, annoyance. Lots of kind of terms come up like disaster, mishap, misadventure, a deep sorrow that especially caused by someone's death, or being overcome with grief. For purposes of this presentation, I would like to invite us to consider that grief's best definition today for me is maybe a conflict of emotions, because sometimes those definitions don't include just sorrow or even death. Maybe it's a little bit more complex than that. So there's some types of grief. We're taking a look here at just some things that we are kind of talking about beyond just normal grief, like nuclear family, a death that looks, is quite well put together. Estate planning's all in order. Everything's good. They lived a long life, lots of family around. But there is many other types of grief that we might be talking about. And I'm going to give you a couple of definitions, not all of these, but anticipatory grief is a term used to describe a mix of emotions that experience when someone is anticipating the loss of a loved one or someone that they that has passed away in their life. It's a unique form of grief that begins before the actual loss or death occurs. Disenfranchised grief is a term that can be describing the experience of losing someone or something that is not openly acknowledged or socially validated. So things like bereavement leave, right? You have to take it only in the death or loss of a close relative or direct relative. And that isn't doesn't fall in line with most of us. Some of us have different types of losses, maybe the end of a relationship or a loss of a friend. Cumulative grief, when losses pile up before one has the opportunity to resolve, we run into a lot of accumulation of grief. Those are a lot of emotions and things to bear. A lot of us who are providers and lose people will feel that. As per the Calgary Distress Center, there are about 10 types of grief. And I think that's a really great definition, and you can kind of take a look at those on your own time. But I feel like there's also something to be said for the collective grief. A lot of people are talking about ecological grief, queer grief. We did a presentation on that. How is that different from nuclear grief? Perinatal and prenatal grief. Collectively, women and mothers have conversations and need support groups for these types of grief. There's also political grief, social grief, probably some economic grief as times get tougher and things just get more expensive and jobs are lost. And I just want to ask you today, what happens when all of these things compound? Melissa?
Yes, it's me. So, as Wynn said, there are many different types of grief. And in order to understand all of those, we must understand how we grieve. So, there is no right or wrong way to grieve. We've all had our own experiences with grieving, but how do we work to understand those we are working with or supporting who are grieving? First, we need to understand how people grieve. There are three different styles, if you will, of how we grieve. They are known as the instrumental griever, the intuitive griever, and then the blended presentation. Now, of course, instrumental and intuitive are two very black and white categories, and we know that grief lives in the gray. As you navigate those that you are supporting, you will learn very quickly that many people can show traits from both sides. This is just to give you a better picture of why someone is grieving the way they are and how you can best support them. First, our instrumental grievers may show up to us as the person who is constantly cleaning up the house, has started a new workout routine, or you notice that they are always at the gym or running or busy in themselves. Maybe since their person died, they've taken on a new activity or bought themselves a new pet. So, instrumental grievers are less likely to express outward emotions. They look for checklists and need set expectations or roles to keep themselves busy. And they seek a cognitive problem solving approach to grieving. So, they focus on the thinking rather than the feeling. On the flip side of that, which is often the style of grieving that the media portrays, is the intuitive grievers. These are the people who we are supporting, who show up as the person who is unable to complete their daily tasks due to their grief. They haven't showered, they haven't been getting dressed, they're only eating toast and tea. Maybe they cancel plans and hobbies they enjoy. They stop going to, or they're quitting their book clubs, their quilting classes. They're removing themselves from that previous life. They're always sad, crying, or talking about the loss. So intuitive grievers express their grief through affect. They develop more extreme emotional symptoms and heal through sharing their feelings with others. Expressions and behaviors will mimic their feelings. They focus on feelings rather than thinking. These are all normal ways to grieve. And then, of course, you'll see the blended grievers. I know for myself, that is where I would fall. So do these two descriptions give you a little bit of a better understanding of the grievers that you're supporting? And if you want to comment in the chat what that looks like and how you feel you support both of those styles. So supporting an instrumental griever means recognizing that they tend to process grief cognitively and behaviorally rather than emotionally. They often focus on the doing, problem solving, organizing. Ways that we can help them is to normalize their style, offer practical support, engage through doing, don't force emotional expression, provide cognitive frameworks, and watch for detailed, delayed impact of the grief or sadness. Supporting an intuitive griever means recognizing that they experience and express their grief primarily through emotion. Their grief often feels very intense, visible, and deeply felt within the body, and we will discuss this later as well. So we need to make space for their emotion. We need to validate the intensity of their emotions, encourage the expression in multiple forms, help with regulation without suppression, and offer containment when needed and protect them against over isolation. So, what is loss? In plain language, loss is the space between how things were and how they are now. The grief reaction is a natural human response to that space in between. On a deeper level, loss is about attachment. It is the experience of having something or someone meaningful changed, diminished, or taken away. Loss is not only about death, but it can be about the disruption of what we expected, relied on, or loved. For the purpose of today's webinar, we'll be talking about grief mostly in the relation to death. So as noted here, there's several types of secondary losses with relation to death of a human. The loss of income, the loss of identity, the loss of our hopes and dreams for the future, sometimes the loss of our faith, of our confidence, the loss of financial security, and the loss of system support. So as you can imagine, many of those secondary losses may not be related to death as well, but all of these losses can lead to grief responses. So what is the missing ingredient? What do we want as Canadians? So 50% of Canadians who were surveyed in 2023 felt that they were not adequately supported in their grief. Almost the exact same amount noted that their grief wasn't recognized. 83% said that by just being asked about their loss was helpful. No crazy modalities or models, simply the act of being human and asking someone about their loss was helpful. As for those of us who work with the bereaved, this one isn't shocking. 93% of Canadians surveyed said that being asked how they could be supported was helpful. Most of the time, asking someone how you can show up for them, either professionally or personally, can be helpful for them. So what do we do? Well, everyone is here, and this is the first step to normalizing the grief experiences for Nova Scotians. Canadians identified needing more access to one-on-one counseling, as well as increased access to tailored grief supports. With the NSHPCA, we are educating the public on grief and how to better support each other. If we can support each other at the community level, the needs for those Tier 3 and Tier 4 supports will lessen.
So where I'm from and my intersections, I mobilize my grief through art, witnessing, holding vigils, and taking part in my community. I have known grief for all of my life as a former youth in care and as someone who has become a social worker and passionate about community connection. I show up physically, even if no one else will. I've been to a tremendous amount of funerals, sometimes even I call them like double digit funerals because there's just so many of them on the downtown east side. And sometimes we would going for 2, 3, or maybe celebrating 5 lives at a time. I ask you, how do you grieve? Who influenced your grief? What rituals do you practice? For me, marching on the streets or having art pieces done of friends or community members that we lost, that is something that I was taught through all of my grief practices. But I ask you, what is the influence of your mourning process? Stephen Jenkinson, author of Die Wise, discusses a lot of how we've become reliant on the palliative care or Meditech um, model of care and grief support. And I wonder how all of you in or out of the industry of care, if your practice includes spirit or the ritual of loss, or do we rely too much on medical models and intervention at a clinical level? This is my experience with grief, but I'm also new to Nova Scotia. So let's move on to the next slide. And I just want to share this picture up in Pictou County here. It's such a privilege to be here. And when I first moved to Nova Scotia and I learned about the landscape and collective losses that Nova Scotians have experienced, and thanks to Matt Villiers, who put together this presentation and influenced us to support the Grief Essentials through the Grief Alliance, he had shared and presented highlights of some of the collective grief Nova Scotians have experienced just since 2020. Reflecting on this was really impactful on me, and I have a lot of work to do as I need to understand fully Nova Scotia's loss, my job is to be able to support these losses, but also understand where there's collective loss happening that might be affecting people. These are just a few things that have happened in the past few years. And not everyone has the privilege of having so much experience with grief. And I'm happy to share with you today that providing education and understanding is definitely a first step in the amount of work that we need to do as a province, but that we have already been doing a lot of community mobilization and understanding of grief. So through the Grief Alliance, we'll have more training and education and supports. And I'm excited for this because I can just see all of the ripple effects of all of these things and the things that are mentioned here. I'm inspired to mobilize our grief and move together because the grief has rippled through all of these events and these communities, and it's a really big task. So I ask you, how do you want to get prepared for your grief literacy? Do you want to talk about these things? Might be a good time to start chatting about it a little bit.
So why does it matter? What is so important about grief and the way we understand it, both in our communities, in our workplaces, in the places we show up? So when we have an understanding of grief and how it shows up in every community across Nova Scotia, we are more apt to create braver spaces for those who are grieving. Grief literacy matters because it helps us to understand grief as a public health and public promotion issue rather than a mental health issue. It recognizes that grief is a part of being human and addresses the pain that arises from grief in a preventative approach to our wellness. You can begin to support and promote grief literacy for yourself and your others in your life and the community as well as across Nova Scotia. So I would like to take a minute to look and consider the 5 stages grief theory or model. So although this model of grieving is debunked, let's talk about what could be helpful for those who are still looking at grief in this way. So the stages, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. When we look at these, what could actually be helpful for people to pull out of that? And with that, what could be harmful? So if you want to take a minute and put those into the chat, if anything. So we all know that the stages of grief were introduced by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross while working with people who were actively dying, not with people who were grieving a death. It was never intended to describe how we grieve, but rather the anticipatory grief that comes. Right? Grief does not fit into a box. So grief is individual. It's shaped by our own relationships, circumstances of the death, cultural beliefs, and other available supports.
Personally, with the amount of grief I have witnessed, I think it is more of an appropriate representation of the grief journey here. To tie back to Kubler-Ross models, I would like to highlight that the Loss Foundation's collection of different models, which are shown here, has been quite substantial. There are many different ways to look at the different types of loss. I think one of them that I definitely see close to the 5 stages of grief is the attachment theory. Dual processing is quite interesting. Resilience models of grief, the 2-track model. I really encourage you guys to take a look at these different models, and you'll see it in the kind of citations and this area here in the presentation. You can actually click there once you receive it in your email inbox and just take a look at them. A great journal entry or a reflection possibility here would be maybe writing a couple of sentences about what your understanding of grief is before clicking on these different modalities and learning a little bit more. And then just write down a couple sentences of that. Reading this quick page on the Loss Foundation's website is an interesting read. And then maybe with your kind of process and reflection of these different models, maybe write down some areas where you think that grief could be supported by another model, like maybe the disenfranchised grief model or the JAR model of grief, which we'll talk about later today. Speaking of journal entries, I sometimes like to include visuals of what the inside of my grief brain looks like, and maybe this will help deconstruct your Kubler-Ross default approach here. I feel like this is a journal entry of mine where it's just like, I have no idea. This is just how I feel today with my grief. There's no stages. Sometimes it's harder, sometimes it's easier, sometimes I just need a hug. So, what is normal grief? Is it just the five stages? Definitely not for me, anyways. There's no real way to dictate what grief should look like, as there's many different emotions under sadness or fear or acceptance. You can see it here in my favorite emotion wheel. I know this is my favorite tool. I don't know about you guys, but I want these stickers on everything. We can't commit to one grief model, but I think that it isn't harmful to say that perhaps we should take a look at the application of trauma-informed care and trauma-informed practices, um, because you will be able to kind of take a look at people's intersections. Maybe these emotions that someone are having are due to the finances. They're really strapped for cash. They have no idea about all of the amount of money they have to spend for someone's death because it was unexpected and they didn't have their advanced care planning or their advanced directives in place. Some complex emotions will come up regarding probate if the estate of their family member go into there. Sorry, guys, don't worry about that. The access to care and information. Some people don't know what even grief is and what their emotions are and how complex it can be, which is probably why we're here today. Traumatic events or traumatic losses can definitely influence the way someone feels about something for sure. But trauma-informed care would consider these and many more intersections that may affect someone's grief. And I encourage you to take a look at what maybe the other intersections of people's lives could impact their grieving and their emotions. It can be really difficult to navigate grief. And as we saw before, that there are many contributing factors to grief in general. I think this display of rumination or constantly being in loop amplifiers can contribute greatly to the prolonged or complex grief. Maybe there's a lot of unresolved grief already, and now there's an actual physical, biological loss in someone's life. Emotional isolation, shame, or guilt. Some people use substances to get through and cope with their grief because it can feel too impending or overwhelming. But also, there's more to grief that we don't understand. There's a complexity in life and mental health practices that may not be able to be addressed. I think that we've heard some of these things. I know I have. They were never really quite the same after someone losing their partner, or I've never seen them that way. It happened so long ago. I don't know why they're getting out of this. They're not eating, they're not sleeping. Iris Gottlieb has a great book that I've attached the citation for in this. More often than not, grieving and loss can create change, interruptions of normalcy, shifts in perspective, and reshaped identities. I think that there is a huge thing to be said for the amount of transition someone goes through when either losing someone or someone suddenly passing away, or they're experiencing a huge loss in their life. Grief can take years to support. It doesn't stop in 1 year. And that's why it's important that we just don't lean on Kubler-Ross's model. These cycles are hard to break, so it can be a good idea for everyone to be aware of resources and encouraging the normalizations and utilizing of resources for grief and loss. Hence why we're talking about grief literacy today.
So grief is multi-level systemic phenomenon. It's not just an individual emotional response. As those supporting grievers, we need to change our mindset from what is happening inside this person to what systems is this grief occurring within. This gives us the basis that the experience of grief is not an exception. It is a constant feature of the human system. Where there are people, there will be grief. There is no universal presentation of grief. This model or graphic demonstrates the key considerations of how each person you will work with will experience grief. Just like that emotional wheel, it gives us the ability to identify our emotions. So, how we experience grief, the attachment, our history, the coping style, the person's past trauma exposure, their mental health history, their capacity for meaning making, and their own recognition of identity disruption with the loss of their person. As we serve and work with these clients, we need to recognize all of these factors within ourselves as well. These are the things that form our own ability, sorry, to support grievers. We can then look at how grief becomes impacted by family systems, healthcare teams, workplaces, schools, and the policies which govern those we support. For example, does their job allow for bereavement days? Are we supported as a clinician or volunteer to have bereavement days for a patient? Collectively, as a community, how do we support grief? What are the access to supports like in each community of those that you work with or support? Is this a collective trauma at a community level? How do we support on a larger scale? Is the community experiencing secondary or vicarious trauma? And finally, culture and society play a large part in how people grieve. As those supporting grievers, we sometimes have a misunderstanding about the cultural, religious, and spiritual frameworks and beliefs about death and dying and mourning. This risks misalignment between providers and family values. Media also influences how a loss can lead to disenfranchised grief in those we are supporting, especially when we are talking about overdose, suicide loss, and miscarriage. Working or volunteering in grief spaces, we need to ensure that we practice with cultural humility and understand that grievers have the best understanding of the way that they are feeling and the supports that they are needing. So this model, which was developed by Lois Tonkin in the early 1990s, challenges one of the most common assumptions we encounter in a clinical community setting. It's that grief gradually gets smaller over time. Many of the people we support, and many of us professionally, may have been taught that healing means the pain should reduce steadily. I know there's been numerous times where I've had family members say to me, "It's been 16 months, I should be over this by now." The dominant cultural narrative suggests that grief shrinks, that with enough time, symptoms decrease and eventually resolve, i.e., we get over it. But clinically, we know that this isn't always how grief is experienced. Tonkin proposed that grief may not shrink, instead that life grows around it. The attachment, the loss, the significance of the person remains, but what changes is our own capacity. This is important in healthcare because ongoing grief is often misinterpreted as complicated or prolonged, simply because it's there. This model reminds us that continuing bonds, anniversary reactions, periodic waves are not signs of failure, but they're signs of attachment. When supporting patients and families, this model can shift our language from "you'll move on" to "you'll learn how to carry this." It also reduces the impulse to measure progress by an emotional reduction. I'd love for you to take the time in the comments to tell us where you may have seen this model or if you've ever noticed it within those you're supporting. So what is a stug? So Teresa Ronaldo, who is a grief expert, coined this term in the early 1990s as well as a way to describe the intense, unexpected waves of emotion that can hit a person long after a loss. We can call them stugs. We can call them a wisp, which is a wave of intense short-term pain. We can call them a rise, a reactive intense surge of emotion, a surge, a sudden upsurge of responsive grief emotion, or sudden temporary upsurge of grief. It doesn't really matter what acronym we use. These are all ways that as clinicians, volunteers, those of us working in the grief space, we are able to help normalize grief. For those we serve, the normalization of a stug makes them feel like they are not alone. When we are grieving, we often have the societal pressure to get over it, move on. Stugs help us to explain that these random upsurges of grief are normal. Many people may build up resilience or ways to cope over time. This could be through their own self-reflection, becoming aware of the signs of the upsurges, or more simply, that they no longer visit a certain section of the park because they've not been able to walk through that part of their emotions yet, and they know that they have more work to do. So I am going to take a minute and share with you our webinar evaluation survey. This is how at the Grief Alliance we use your feedback to continue to build education that is needed throughout our communities. And I'd also like to hear if anyone wants to pop in the chat any experiences they might have felt that have brought up a stug for them. I will say we we lost our golden lab recently, and of course Facebook knows it now in my algorithm, and we are filled with golden lab pieces, and that's one of those things that just brings up that emotion that didn't really know was still there. Anniversaries, birthdays. Yep. Go ahead, Rune.
So, when we grieve, especially a sudden or unexpected loss, our bodies and brains, they already know what to do. We've been dying for millennia. We've been grieving since the day we were born or conceptualized. In the beginning of time, emotions have been there as well. Happy emotions, sad emotions. We've been grieving. We've been going through loss. Our bodies know what to do. Um, we have been eaten by large prey at times. And in our past of our natural responses to danger have evolved over time. Studies have found out that while we're grieving, we revert to our amygdala, which is our primal state and response. So you can see here the fear center of the brain. It's when that is activated or overactive. That is the part of our brain that tells us we have to fight, flight, freeze, maybe flag, fawn. Some of us faint. There is so many things going on when we go through loss. And sometimes it just takes a little bit of food for thought to kind of think through those processes. And our job as practitioners and as supports for this is to really normalize what's going on. Think of a time when you first found out that someone has moved away or you lost someone or someone's no longer with us anymore. When we're supporting through someone, sorry, when we are supporting someone who is going through a loss, we should consider understanding the response we may have had as an involuntary response, and then understand that they might be going through that as well. You'll see your brain there is on the left is so full of food, can think things through a little bit more properly. And then on grief, I don't even know where to start. Am I getting dressed? Do I need to write a grocery list? Remember where the store is. Remember your keys. Remembering milk goes in the fridge and not the cupboard. I've been there before. Um, it's normal to be afraid and to have these various responses to grief. When something happens that is traumatic or there's a loss, it's okay to have different responses. There's also physiological and somatic responses in times of grief. That is very normal. Try it out. Next time you lose something, reflect on what your body is responding before your emotions do. If you lose something really important to you and you have a Grief Essentials presentation coming up with the Grief Alliance, but you've lost your glasses and the internet just cut out, I have stomach pain that made me feel really sick. I thought everything was going to go bad. I wasn't going to be able to present today. I'm losing the ability to do something. My stomach was wrecked for a few minutes before my presentation today. What about when you lose your keys when you're trying to make that really important doctor's appointment that you haven't been to yet and it's been rescheduled multiple times and you really need to go and you lose those keys? What happens in your body? Let alone what happens if you hear of a sudden loss, something going on in the news. There's a lot of polycrises that are going on right now, and watching the news and finding out more information about the grief and loss that we feel. Watch what your tummy does or your appetite. Do you have some chest pain? When helping someone with grief and understanding grief, it can be really helpful to look at what their physiological responses are. And taking a look here, I wanted to point out the science behind emotional storage in the fascia. There's some studies and conversations going on about how grief can actually present itself physically through the fascia, which is here. And I kind of describe it as if you were to look at a orange, there is a pith, P-I-T-H, around the orange, that white layer, and it holds in all of the juice. That's what's in our muscles here. And you can see that by moving it, it can be really helpful. But if you stay sterile and sedentary, it can kind of close up here because you're not really moving the fascia. I, as someone with a lot of trauma in my life, have scoliosis, and that is not from a birth defect. It's from being kind of in this state of fight or flight for so long that it has affected me. So taking a look at fascia, stress, the grief that can be held on to the body, digestive issues, fatigue, these are all normal things to go through, but definitely can be helped through resources.
So how do we support ourselves when we are supporting grievers? We must acknowledge our thoughts and feelings, not avoid or escape them, but noticing their presence. We must connect by coming back into our own bodies, and we must engage in what we're doing. So everyone says be kind to yourself, or, you know, I used to say that I was a pediatric palliative care nurse, and immediately I was met with, oh, that must be so hard. That must be so sad. When you are providing support in someone's grief journey, we must remember that our own minds and bodies are always the harshest critics. So this grief work is heavy, and it is also some of the most meaningful work that I have had the opportunity to be a part of in my career. So taking care of yourself allows you to take care of others, providing a safer space for the families, clients, and those you interact with. When we talk about self-care and grief work, think of it this way. Self-care is achieved when you can give yourself and your loved ones the best of you instead of what is left of you at the end of the day. This was something that really resonated with me, and I made it a point in my own career to ensure that my family got the best of me. So, as providers, we must acknowledge our thoughts and feelings and connect with others and engage in the spaces we are showing up. Grief does not sit with the person who experienced the loss. As we travel through these spaces with them, you can also experience their grief. We experience their heavy just by virtue of their stories. This is normal, this is okay, and we are all human. You must practice self-compassion, and it's okay to not know the perfect response. Oftentimes, we treat others with more compassion than we would treat ourselves. Working with grieving individuals sometimes means that you're carrying their stories. These stories are of sorrow, trauma, and uncertainty. Naming the emotional impact without judgment within yourself is the first step in managing it. Noticing signs of compassion fatigue, numbness, irritability, or exhaustion. Allowing yourself to have emotional reactions. It doesn't make you unprofessional, it just makes you human. I used to tell my families that I was an internal waterfall and that sometimes it leaks out, but that they did not need to comfort me. Maintaining boundaries, firm but not rigid, protects both you and those you support. This may mean defining clear limits around your availability, whether that means emails, after hours messaging, last minute requests, and sometimes social media. Keeping a structure to your meetings. Boundaries are not barriers. They're just the containers that keep both us and those we support safe. The work that we do, the spaces that we show up for grief, must not be done in isolation. Debriefing with a supervisor, a peer, or a trusted colleague regularly. Normalize that check-in after particularly heavy sessions or community tragedies. Using a reflective practice, like Rune mentioned, journaling, voice notes, anything to process those emotions. This is just ethical self-care. This is not the self-indulgent, take a bath, go for a walk. These are ways that we are just able to take care of ourselves to keep showing up. So in our roles, we offer a presence to others. So you must cultivate regulation for yourself. Mindfulness, grounding, somatic exercises, even 2 minutes helps. Breath work between sessions to reset your nervous system, gentle rituals that transition your day in between sessions or when you get home. That can be closing your laptop, stepping outside, washing your hands. For me, it was coming home from work and immediately changing out of my work clothes. My kiddos knew that this was my 2 minutes. I just needed that to check out of work and to come home. So your body keeps score of everyone's grief that you hold. Regular movements, walking, stretching, yoga, strength training, adequate sleep and hydration, and eating regularly. Sometimes grief work, as I'm sure most of you know, will often disrupt our appetite and energy. And knowing when to take care of yourself. So we all deserve care as well. Personal therapy or counseling, a grief group for helpers, a spiritual advisor, elder, or cultural leader. You cannot pour from an empty nervous system. Recognize when you need a pause, listening to the early signals that you are approaching your limits, emotional numbness, difficulty being present, increased irritability, dread before sessions, or feeling overwhelmingly responsible for others' healing. These are cues for rest. They are not signs of failure. Everybody that's here, the work that you do, the places that you step into, and the supports that you provide are all very heart-centered, heavy, rewarding, and demanding jobs, roles. You need to regularly remind yourself why you do this work, the impact that you make, and the importance of compassionate communities. Grief is shared, it is not solved. Knowing what is available to you and those in your community or workplace, providing support is an excellent way to show up amongst each other.
Thanks, Melissa. I feel like I identify with a lot of need for those things. We had a session earlier within the Grief Alliance about burnout versus compassion fatigue, and I encourage everyone, if you are in the grief space, to take a look at that. It is some good information just to be able to understand compassion fatigue and burnout when we're dealing with grief after grief after grief. So there's this thing called platitudes where we just think we have to say the right thing at all times and that these things might be the right things to say because we saw it on TV or someone said it to us at some point and it just kind of settled in. There's been a lot of misconception of grief and loss, as well as how to respond to those things due to media and a lack of literacy of grief, but also of death. So there's some forcing of fixing people or perhaps pathologizing people, even within the medicalization of grief and loss, uncomfortable emotions. Um, and some things that some people tend to say are things like time heals all wounds, God needed another angel, just open-ended questions. How are you? Sometimes can't sit right with everyone, especially if they've just experienced a loss. How am I? Well, let me tell you, or I don't even know where to start might be an answer to that. And it's kind of complex. So I encourage sitting within all of these terms and seeing if they feel comfortable to you, maybe kind of identifying them, seeing where you might have learned it from and how it might be feel to be receiving these comments. And everyone else is going to be kind of saying these things. So I just want to encourage that your words will impact someone during this time. You don't need to fix anything. Consider your own discomfort during this time and maybe just sitting with someone, just witnessing what they're going through and just saying, this sucks. I don't know how to help. I don't know what words should be coming out of my mouth, but I'm here for you and I'm okay with this uncomfortable feeling right now. Let me sit with you if you don't mind. If people really don't remember the words, because it can be hard to remember all of those things, they will remember how you made them feel. So I'm going to talk about platitudes a little bit, a bit of a do and don't maybe, or a consideration conversation point that we can definitely go through once the presentation is over. But every day is different, and we need to change the grief story a little bit. Mary Ellen MacDonald states the expert is in grief is the griever. So I don't know everything. I'm not going to be able to tell you what to do, what not to do. It's too complex to be able to say what will happen if you are supporting someone who's grieving. But I do recommend saying something like, I'm here to listen. I don't have the right words, but I'm right here with you. Do you want to share with me how you're feeling? Or are you okay with me just being here for you? Offering, would you like to hear about my experience? And would that help, or would you like me to just listen? Easy decision, one or the other. What feels right? And asking for consent, like may I check in with you this week? Showing up and holding space is the best thing we can do, but let the griever guide you through their discomfort with minimal decision making. Remember, they might feel like they have just had a very close run-in with a grizzly bear. So just the decision making in this area will be really hard. So yes or no questions and just kind of skirting around those open-ended questions other than maybe, do you want to share with me? I had a great example recently given to me by someone who said in an emergency response, someone just couldn't figure out time and they were having a lot of issues with time. And the person that was supporting was saying, look outside. When the sun comes down and you haven't had any water, that is a really good indicator for needing to refill that cup. So, changing the grief story, we want to recognize the griever's feelings may be complex and we don't know how they might be feeling. We cannot assume someone's feelings about their loss. So, saying things like, it is okay that you don't know how you feel right now, or it's okay to feel relief. Sometimes there may be cases where people have gone through a loss and they're relieved that someone is not in so much pain anymore. Or maybe sometimes people are having someone die who was an abuser or someone who's really, really, really not a safe person for them in their life. It's okay to feel relief about that death, that loss. This is a lot to carry. Yeah, the world feels really heavy when you're grieving. I can't imagine how you might be feeling right now. And then following that up with, but I'm here for anything that you might feel. If you want to get angry, if you want to yell, if you want to be sad, getting it out, I'm okay with that. But only offer that if you're ready to receive it, right? So things to avoid, phrases or platitudes to avoid. How are you doing? Open-ended. I don't know. If you have an emotion wheel handy, I might be able to point to one, but honestly, I'm just really lost. Telling someone not to cry, or shoving Kleenexes in their face. That's a big no-no. Sometimes people just need to cry and just let it go. You're never given more than you can handle. I do not like that being said to me. I've been told that a couple times in my life, as well as calm down. Not the best thing to say to me, especially when I'm going through a loss or a big emotional kind of moment. So again, changing the grief story, showing empathy and compassion. I think this website or this video everyone has seen, especially if you're a social worker, but this is talking about empathy. It's the Empathy Bear if you look it up on YouTube. And asking questions like, what was their name? What has it been like for you? What was your relationship to them? Checking in, especially with that platitude down there. Tell me about your loved one. That's not the case for all people when they're going through loss. Maybe it's not a loved one. Maybe it's a very complex person in their life. What was your relationship to them? And would you like to share something about them with me? I find that a lot of times, especially within marginalized communities or within the queer grief community or grieving queer community, um, they don't get to focus more on the person who has passed away, but how they should be feeling and what they need to mobilize their grief for, like finances or helping out the community around them. Do you want me to share too, or just listen? That's empathetic. That's being able to find some camaraderie and experience, but not just saying things like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, or it's all a part of God's plan. I think that can be helpful for some, maybe, but for me, I know that would be more dismissive and not so empathetic to me, because it's really just in the feelings of this sucks is sometimes the most helpful thing to say. Supporting their loss actively. I'm a journal girl, love journal. I definitely recommend having a journal around, especially when someone's going through loss, death, grief, and you're kind of supporting through that journey. You have a lot to carry right now. Is there something I can take off your plate? Writing things down or doing paperwork, super helpful. Sometimes asking questions like, what would you like to do to memorialize this person? How can I help recreate memories in certain areas? If you can't walk in a park anymore because it's too overbearing, maybe we can one day talk about making other memories and connecting in that space and maybe beautifying that space, maybe adding a tree to recreate sort of the being of someone there. That would be important. Is there someone we can connect you with to help support you ongoing? As a clinician, I like to ask that to find out what's going on in the community. Do you have community around you? Is there isolation? Is there anything I can help kind of bolster your community and connections? You know, the resources around. And then, of course, again, writing things down. Maybe it's to-do lists, remembering when things might come up. There's a lot of dates that will come up when you lose someone or when they lose someone. So offering to write down all the overwhelming dates, like I need to talk to the funeral director by this time. I need to be able to follow up with this. And, you know, there's so many people to check in with. Sometimes it helps to just write things down. Platitudes to avoid would definitely be like, these things all happen eventually. This is just a part of life. Time heals all wounds. It is true at times, time heals all wounds, but it can also just be really demoralizing when you're like figuring out how to survive in a world without a human that you were very connected to or without a relationship that you had. Time feels inevitable and also very scary sometimes. I don't want to lose that person or forget that person. Sustaining grief in the long run, boundaries and follow through. Definitely important. Melissa talked about that a few moments ago, being able to follow through with, okay, like I'm not available at all times for your loss. However, I am here between 8 and 4. You see, when the sun is up, I will be here during that time, and feel free to call me. Or navigating being able to provide other supports, perhaps hospice or palliative care have some sort of support group ongoing that could be really helpful. You don't have to be someone's superhero when they're going through loss. Saying things like, I will check in on you in a few days, give a solid date or a time, and then maybe encouraging some changing of ritual or practice during holidays or birthdays. It's going to be really difficult during that first year, especially with the first birthday without that person or the first holiday without this dynamic or this friendship. And can we work together to help you with long-term loss? These are great questions to ask, maybe in some time, not after an immediate loss, but these are kind of the questions to sustain during the long run. Building legacy, checking in often, and being able to ask questions about people, especially if you knew them, sharing good stories and good light. That always is definitely something that I like. But just saying nothing and understanding that this is not the same as silence is also sometimes quite damaging. Offering specific help. This is my last one, and then we'll be changing the grief story in the last two platitudes here. But I know your back must be sore. Can I help with anything? Garbage is laundry. Keep in mind what someone's body might be feeling like. Maybe they can't lift things too heavy. I know grief sits in my lower back. How about your guys's? When I drive the carpool, what if I drive the carpool next month? Can I help with the kids? These are all things that we can support as a community to support with people, especially when there's large amounts of loss within our community. Being able to help with supporting what do you need after a while can be a really good check-in. And personalizing your own tribute. If you knew someone, no one owns the grief just because you aren't related or directly connected. Sometimes it can be really helpful and lovely to personalize your own tribute. I'd like to honor them this way. Can we commemorate their memory like this? Maybe working on a photograph for an office, or sometimes, like you saw in my earlier presentation or part of the presentation, being able to have photos of people around or artwork. This is how I would like to celebrate their life with you. They would have wanted it this way. We don't know that. We don't know. People are connected in different ways, so I'd avoid that question or that phrase. And last but not least, mistakes will happen. Be kind to yourself. Don't be afraid to call in extra resources or supports. It's okay not to know everything about how to respond to grief. We're all just starting this conversation. It's all our first times on this planet. So be kind to yourself. You can't do everything. We are not a superhero in every moment. Sometimes we get emotional and sometimes we get burnt out and have that compassion fatigue. So remember to take care of yourself and don't worry too much about the mistakes. We're all in this together, and reach out if you need any extra supports or anything. So now I just want to check in. It's the end of our presentation. We're just going to go over some resources and wrap up the day with each other. But I want to check in, and we're going to have Beth pop up the poll for us here. How would you rate your understanding of grief now? We had a solid 7 before, so we're curious to see how you might be feeling about things now. Do you feel like you learned some new words, some new concepts, maybe an idea, things to say, community things you could do? Cool. We're seeing some upticks. Yeah, absolutely. And more in the 8s, the 9s. You're feeling kind of confident with this. We still have a couple 10s, sorry. Awesome. It's awesome to see that here. And it's really cool to see some of the increased grief literacy. And remember, this is just 101. This is just the beginning, just a beginning conversation. We'll have more specialized things, but this is our grief essentials, and we're just starting the conversation. So good job, guys. You learned a lot today. We have quite a few responses there. Thank you.
So, is there any questions before we get into resources? I just want to give everybody the opportunity to raise your hand, come off mic. If there's any, you know, question that you're like, but I've said this and how do I fix that? Um, One of the big things, like Rune said, it's okay to make mistakes, but recognizing those mistakes is a huge part of how we support those. Yeah, Mia. Maya.
Mia,
Mia. Okay.
nice to meet everyone. I had an experience a long time ago where I was supporting someone who was losing their child, and
Mm,
it was very last minute, and the child was taken off life support
mm,
against the mother's wishes, but there was no alternative at that point. Um, I had been with this person for about 5, 6 months, and I had been there every time her child had a life-threatening surgery that needed to be completed. And at the end, that's what happened after the child was getting better. So it was very, 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 very full of grief because of the hope that existed before.
mm,
Um, I found it super challenging because I was young and I was inexperienced and I didn't have the resources I have now.
Yeah.
Definitely not. But I was wondering about what it looks like when grief shows up as anger and fight,
Mm,
because this mother,
mm,
and I cannot judge her for what she went through, the way she dealt with it, because she just couldn't, just in the moment, she dealt with it with fight by fighting with the staff and with the doctors. And she was so upset that all I could do was stand and be present for every single time she called me, and I felt at the time that the kindest thing to do was just allow her to move through it. But I will say it's incredibly challenging when grief
mm.
shows up as anger.
mm.
So I just wondering if there's any experience, because I didn't see anger as part of it. I know sometimes maybe we lump it in with trauma. This was different. So I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about when it shows up as anger.
So I will start this only because you did an amazing job. I will say that as
Mm,
being a pack nurse, as working with moms with traumatic loss, unexpected loss, prolonged loss, you did an amazing job. She needed she needed to mobilize that grief. And the
mm,
only way for her to do it, because child loss it's a very different type of grief than losing your partner of forever, your mom, your grandparent. It's a very different type. It goes against the grain of how life and death is supposed to work.
mm,
So for her, that she needed a place to take that grief and to let it out. And you just being the person to say, okay, I can't fix this. There's nothing I can do. I've been a part of everything with you. And to just stand there, as hard as it is, as the supporter, to just stand there and let her mobilize that grief, you did the right thing. So I've been in that situation, and just being that person that they know is not going to fix this for me. It's just going to let me provide, not even provide, to get that anger out and to hate everybody because they didn't change it. They didn't fix it. They did it wrong. Those are all the emotions, right? And we're not agreeing with them one way or another because, like you said, the situation was life support and there was no other option. So this is maybe the 15 steps leading up to that were wrong, but that's not for us. That's for her. So for myself at the pediatric with the registered nurse at that level, she needs more support than I can give her.
mm,
But being able to be there and to let her mobilize that into me and to be just, like you said, silence instead of not saying anything, there's a
mm.
difference. And she needed you in that silence. So, Rune, I don't know if you have more to
I have
offer
a lot
that.
of experience with that
Oh,
as working with perinatal substance use myself. A lot of removals of children, a lot of grief, a lot of conflict. Um, Something that I really had to wrestle with it with myself is just understanding. for me, and this is not to say like this would be your experience, but for me, the conflict, general conflict, because I see that as conflict, is not abuse in that moment for me in my head. Like, of course, there is abuse and behaviors that shouldn't be okay. But for me, what I had to understand was that it's not about me at all. It's conflict, and conflict is okay. And we're seeing people in their worst moments, not their finest days. And something about loss is that you don't get the privilege of doing that in private, right? And that for me was with people who were homeless. So I was experiencing people's worst days and I couldn't take that on. It's not to say that you shouldn't. However, understanding that conflict and um, repair, resolve, and time, those are things that will take only so much time. And it is our first time on the planet, all of us. We can't be perfect in every moment. And believing that we have to be perfect in every moment could kill us. It's exhausting. We're going to make mistakes. Community happens and it's messy and we can't be perfect every time. But I think you did an amazing job just being there and just holding space. 99% of my job is just witnessing. It's witnessing other people's experiences and then advocating for them in the best ways that I can and not trying not to take things too personal in that sense, even when there's anger. Anger is really scary, but also it's a really valid response, I would say.
Mhm.
Thank you for
Yeah.
that question. Does anyone else have any questions or want me to go through the grief resources? I kind of pulled away from moving these along, but I'm happy to take any questions if we want.
Yeah, we can talk through the grief resources and I'll let people come forward. Um, so we have a small list here. There is a huge list of grief resources. We have the Healing Pathways Grieving Well resource listed here. That is an online local grief and emotional wellness tool. So you are able to go on there, type in where you're located, and it brings up the resources that are both online and in person with relation to grief. We also have the Nova Scotia Health Life Changes. This is Nova Scotia Grief, Bereavement, Trauma, and Resiliency Supports. So this is both for providers as well as community. And then we have the Nova Scotia Grief Alliance. So you're all here. And this strengthens our grief support through education, resource sharing, community collaboration. Beth is on the links.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're good. Next, we have 211. So this is an phone resource to navigate local grief and mental health supports. So you're able to talk to a human and they're able to provide you guidance on where the supports would be that you're looking for. We have Grief Matters. So we talked a lot about Mary Ellen MacDonald. She is the co-founder of Grief Matters. So this is grief literacy organization offering programs in Nova Scotia and across Canada. And we also have the Canadian Virtual Hospice through the Learning Hub. So this is the national provider facing evidence-based education and resources for grief. Kids Help Phone, the Dougie Center. Like I said, Kids Help Phone, or Canadian Virtual Hospice rather, with mygrief.ca, kidsgrief.ca. They have a huge list of resources when you go onto their website for any type of grief that you are looking to support or that you are working to support. We have Nova Scotia Health Guides, so they have their palliative care grief support guides there as well. Resources and different supports. We have Roots of Hope Nova Scotia. So this is a collaboration through Nova Scotia Health and the Mental Health Commission of Canada. This is for suicide prevention interventions, as well as we are working with them to provide some grief supports. We have mental health resources through the CMHA of Nova Scotia Division. And I think I have one more page. Yeah, the Couch of Hope. So mental health counseling services for Nova Scotians who do not have insurance and cannot afford to pay out of pocket. So these can all be found on the Grieving Well as well. But we just wanted to give you a couple of them to look at there. And lastly, our evaluation survey. So as the Grief Alliance, Rune and I are working to take everybody's feedback across the province and to provide education on the types of grief that we are encountering, that we are supporting, that we are navigating, that we just don't feel comfortable in. So it only takes a few minutes. There's a QR code. We've also just put the link in the chat as well. So this is how we determine what education is coming next. So like our webinars on pet loss, our virtual roundtable focused on suicide, grief, and loss. So yeah, we just want to thank everybody for coming today.
Yeah, and I'm just taking a look. I didn't mean to avoid the chat. It's just that I was presenting, so there's only a couple of screens, but I'm just taking a look at it now. And I think there's quite a few really great pieces
Mm.
if anyone wants to come off mic. I'm just looking briefly now, but one that stands out to me is the loss of Africville, history of the NS Home for Colored Children and collective grief in the African Nova Scotian community. We actually have a funded project to be able to do some grief needs and assessments and advanced care planning. And this is definitely a piece of grief that has come up. And we're planning on doing some education sessions on that for sure. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot also of no specific order, stages, no real guidebook on how to grieve, really. It's pretty messy. We also have, I think we can add that in here, and we have many resources with it, but the grief library run through the Valley Hospice Society is definitely one that I would also recommend. I'll try and get a link here for you in a second. But many books, they've kind of done like general grief, and now they're kind of getting all specialized books and supports, and they'll mail you a book on grief if you're needing some extra education pieces.
Yeah, Mia, Communities for Fishermen. So I'm in Cape Breton.
Mm,
Um, we are strong fishermen. All of our miners have turned to fishermen now, and when a boat goes out and doesn't come back, it's not just that boat and those families that are affected. Everybody that lives on the water is affected by that. Yeah. And it's how do we come together as a community to support that when we're all grieving together.
mhm.
And that's okay to be a civilian, John. We, if you watch for Healthy Nova Scotia, through the Nova Scotia Health, we will be doing grief essentials for community-based lens. So I hope you were able to take something from this, but we will be doing more there as well. And it's a two-part session. So lots more information and not as clinical.
We're gonna have we have a lot of exciting kind of things that we want to go into, like directions that we want to go into. I mean, even my own intersections, I've started having conversations within the harm reduction community, especially with overdose loss. We have the Queer Grief 101 was a great response, and there's a need for talking about trans grief and some of the kind of oncoming changes within policy and access to harm reduction or gender affirming care, that type of thing. Perinatal loss, we have so many ideas, lived experience, how to include them in your practices. So it's just the beginning of us starting out and talking about these conversations, but it can get really deep. And the best way to tell us what you want is to do the survey and tell us word for word, this is what we want, this is what we want, because we will be able to implement that. If we see harm reduction 5 times, then okay, 5 people want this, maybe that's a topic we can talk about. I really encourage you guys to do these, because then we're able to shift our funding. Think of us as something that you can mold and create your own space through those feedback forms, because we take them seriously, we look at them. I really encourage you to do that. So if we can do more support with that, for sure, we will.
Yeah, Sarah mentioned grieving the people who are still here. And then John, you
Mhm,
added on to that. There's two very different groups of that, right? It's the relationship that you wish you had, if it's an
mhm,
estranged parent or family member. And we often we compare our grief, oh, well, I don't get to grieve that as much because my person's still here. I
mhm,
just don't talk to them. And John,
mhm,
for your case with your wife having dementia, you're grieving her while she's still here. And that
mhm,
sometimes you don't feel like you're allowed to do that because she is still here, right? But there's so many pieces of that life that she's still here, but your life with her looks different. And there's
mhm,
the ways that you're trying to navigate that and feel like it's okay. And it is okay to grieve that. That's anticipatory grief. That's caregiver grief. There's a lot of terms that sits in that situation. And just grieving the unknown and grieving what's already happening and then grieving the
mhm.
known. Yeah, there's a lot of grief that we don't normalize enough, that we don't recognize as a society as being grief. We
Mhm.
just say, oh, that's what it is. That's how it's going to happen. And
Yeah,
that's kind of taken the value away from us.
totally. I'm actually doing a presentation on ambiguous loss with care. Is it the Alzheimer's Society,
Alzheimer's
I think?
Society. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to be doing, I have three ambiguous loss discussions going to be happening. So that is something that we definitely need. And I encourage you to look at those resources as well if you aren't already on there. Community grief that is ignoring in the valley following the wildfires last summer. We actually have great conversations with School Plus about the fact that there's a lot of ecological grief, especially as wells are drying up and the weather is changing and kids are showing up not able to shower, have access to resources, and then a lack of mobilization within hygiene and support, and also the loss of water. Water is very precious to us. We have a lot of political grief. We have a lot of polycrises happening across the planet. Think of how many conflicts, genocides, and or just general linear violence between family members, even losing that with how much we have been divided with social media. There's a lot of grief. There's a lot of things to talk about. Grief shows up everywhere. We're just touching on grief today, really and truly.